All right, I think we're going to get the show on the road here. Good afternoon to our alumni and friends. My name is Tom Pico, and I'm a UMaine class of '88, and I'm the president and CEO for the UMaine Alumni Association. Kind of a cloudy day on campus here in Orono today, but the snow is pretty much gone, so spring is on the way, and we're looking forward to that. We are thrilled to bring you another edition of our periodic webinar series to reach UMaine alumni near and far, and I know we have both on here today with updates on a variety of topics from the University of Maine. Today, we're very excited to feature a presentation by Professor Mark Brewer, and I will introduce him in just a moment following a couple of housekeeping items that I want to share with you. First, we want to make sure that everyone is aware that today's session is being recorded, and we will share this recording online at a later date for those who are unable to join us today. Secondly, we will have time for a few questions for Professor Brewer today following his presentation. And I'd like to ask if you would like to ask a question at that time, you can do that in one of two ways. One being at the bottom of your screen, there is a react button. And if you click that, you'll see a raise hand feature there. So after Dr. Brewer's presentation, if you want to raise your hand, we will call on folks individually and let them ask their question of Dr. Brewer directly in front of the group. If you would rather submit a chat to me with your question, you can do that. Just find my name, Tom Pico, in the chat feature and send your question to me via chat, and I can ask it on your behalf. For those that choose to ask their question directly of Dr. Brewer, of course, just a friendly reminder that we'd like to get to as many questions as possible, so we'd ask you to be concise and to the point. And of course, this is not really a platform for political opinions, but rather for questions to Dr. Brewer. So we appreciate your cooperation with that. Thank you. And we will have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, and we'll get to as many questions as we can before we get to that hour. So now it's my privilege to introduce our presenter. Since 2004, Mark Brewer has served on the faculty of the University of Maine's Political Science Department and currently serves as the department's chair. Dr. Brewer is a nationally recognized voice in the field of political science and has earned a reputation as a go-to political expert who delivers timely, accessible, knowledgeable, and nonpartisan insights on issues in Maine and the United States. Across more than 1,500 interviews with reporters from local, national, and international news organizations, Dr. Brewer has offered analyses on congressional races, ranked choice voting, policy issues, partisanship, polarization, which he'll address those today, and other topics. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, USA Today, and NPR are among the many outlets that have featured him. As a scholar of political behavior, Dr. Brewer has also shared his expertise through 2 textbooks, 6 other books, and dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles, chapters, and review. Last year, the University of Maine Alumni Association was proud to recognize Dr. Brewer as our 2025 Distinguished Maine Professor, which is widely recognized as the highest faculty honor at the University of Maine. While he is sadly a Yankees fan, you can see that Dr. Brewer has many other admirable qualities, and we are so fortunate to have faculty like Dr. Brewer here at the University of Maine. So, Professor Brewer, thank you for joining us today, and we'll turn it over to you.
Well, Tom, thank you for that welcome, and I'll note that my Yankees are off to a good start, although the Red Sox are too. So I'm looking forward to another exciting season of American League East baseball for sure. So. And in some ways, baseball, at least for some of us, is probably a more pleasant topic than the current state of American politics, which is certainly causing a lot of Americans at least some level of angst and anxiety. And I think part of the reason why, for many Americans, they're not terribly happy with the state of our current political affairs is that they see our politics and our public life as highly polarized and divided, right? And I think, if we were to go back, say, 30 years, right? I was finished my dissertation in 2001. So throughout the second half of the 90s, I was engaged in my coursework and my dissertation research. And at that time, there was a really heated debate within American political science about whether or not American politics was polarized or not, right? And the scholar that I completed my dissertation under, Dr. Jeff Stonecash at Syracuse, was on the side that yes, there is pretty strong evidence here of polarization in American politics, and that fight went on within the discipline for the better part of a decade until by the time we got to the mid 2000s or late 2000s, I think it was clear that the evidence indicated that we were, in fact, pretty highly polarized in our politics and our public life. And I think that polarization has only grown in the 15 years or so since. And so there's no longer any doubt that American politics, as it currently stands, is highly polarized, right? If we look at the 2024 presidential election, we can see the highly partisan nature of that polarization, right? 95% of Democratic voters voted for Kamala Harris for president. 94% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump for president. Even though, there was a non-insignificant amount of Democrats who weren't thrilled with Harris and Republicans who were less than enamored of Trump, right? Another measure of maybe how polarized we are that I think is interesting to think about is if you go back to 1960 and you asked Americans if they would be bothered if their child married someone of the opposite political party. In 1960, only 5% of Americans said yes, that would bother them, either some or a high amount. Today, depending on the poll you look at, anywhere between 40 and 50% of Americans say that they would be bothered if their child married someone of the opposite political party, right? And in some ways, the polarization might even be worse among young voters, right? Which is not something we typically think about. Some poll results from late last year asked 18 to 29-year-olds about their dating preferences, and the poll was all about dating preferences. So for most of the content in there was not of interest to us today, but there was one question that asked if these 18 to 29-year-olds would date someone from the opposite political party, and 60% of them said they would not, right? That they would not date someone from the opposite major political party, which is in my opinion, a staggeringly high number. And I asked my students about it when I saw that, and many of them said, "Yeah, I wouldn't do that," which is foreign to me, right? When I was in the 18 to 29-year-old age group, those kind of things didn't even come up. So kind of fascinating, right? Um, there's no doubt, the same way that there's no doubt that we're polarized today, there's also no doubt that we've been pretty highly polarized at previous points in American political history. And I think that's something important to point out because when you read a lot of the accounts of, the polarized state that we're in the media today, they fail to talk about that. And if you go back to, for example, the early 19th century, American politics was highly polarized. I still think the nastiest presidential campaign in American history was the campaign between Adams and Jefferson in 1800. It was knock down, drag out, nasty. The period of time in the late 19th century, say the 1880s, 1890s, also an incredibly highly polarized period in American politics. But in many ways, this current period feels different from those, right? The polarization not only seems to be stronger, but in some ways is maybe a little nastier, has a little bit of a sharper edge. We're certainly not in the 1850s, 1860s yet, right? We haven't reached that stage. But how far off we are from that, I think, is a matter that's up for debate, right? So given where we are, I think it's important for us to understand how we got to this point, right? Some of us, if not many of us on this call, are old enough to remember a time when politics in the United States looked very different than how it looks today, right? So how do we get here? And I think we need, in order to fully understand how we got here, I think there's two periods of time that are most important for us to kind of focus on, right? The first of those two periods is, um, say the mid 1960s to the early 1970s, and we look at um, the high levels of political and cultural and racial unrest of that period. We look at some of the um, kind of unrest surrounding the Vietnam War, and I think a fair amount of our polarization today can see its roots traced back to the that period of time, mid '60s, early 1970s, and there are some measures of polarization that we can empirical measures that we can track far enough back in time that will demonstrate that origin point of say mid '60s, late or early 1970s, right? So that's one period of time. I don't think that fully explains where we are, and I think if you want to focus in on a second period of time, then you really need to get into the 1990s, and that the period of the 60s, early 70s, I think makes sense when people think about the tumultuous times that represented and say, okay, I can understand how contemporary polarization can trace back to that period. But the 90s maybe is a little bit more of a surprising era to focus on because people think about the 90s and they generally, tend to look back on that period of time today, at least with a little bit of nostalgia that, maybe the 90s wasn't so bad. American politics, they think, was relatively civilized and everybody seemed to get along and thinking, why would we put the 90s here? And I think part of the reason why we see it that way is I think we've forgotten a lot about what went on in the politics of that decade, right? I do think that, for example, the conflict and the style of politics, for example, that Newt Gingrich brought into the mainstream in the 1990s and the direction in which he pushed the Republican Party, and then maybe the direction in which the Democratic Party moved in response, are really critical to understanding where we are today. So I think we need to look at both the '60s, early '70s, and the '90s to figure out how we got where we are today. Right. So within those periods of time, um, I'd like and trying to figure out or answer the question of how did we get here. I'd like to bring up briefly, and if people are interested, we can expand on this in the Q&A. Maybe five developments or phenomena that either started or grew or took place during those periods of time that help us understand why we are where we are in our politics. One of those, and this is definitely one that we can trace back to the '60s, is this, the rise in what are labeled the culture war issues in American politics, right? When people talk about the culture wars, which is, take its name from a book by University of Virginia sociologist James Davison Hunter. When people talk about culture war issues, they're talking about, kind of social issues like abortion or the place of women in society or LGBTQ plus issues, right? At one point, obscenity pornography was on that list. I'm not sure it would be anymore, but those are the kind of issues we're talking about. And if you look back in American politics um, before the late '60s, early '70s, for the most part, those issues really didn't show up in American politics. There were some exceptions, right? I mean, if you can go back to the 19th century and talk about the Comstock Act, and okay, so there's some connections there, but those issues existed, of course, in American society, but they weren't part of the political debate. That changed in the 1960s, and it's only grown over time. And I think as those issues kind of forced themselves onto the public stage, that helped drive some division at first between the parties and then between Americans themselves. That's one thing we need to look at. Um, Another thing we need to look at is the relatively high levels of social and economic change that have taken place over the last 50 or so years. And again, American society has always been a highly dynamic society marked by high levels of change. But I think, if you look at the last half century or so, the changes that we've seen in areas of race and social class and sex and education, religious tradition, the type of community that people live in, and how each of those divides have taken on a highly partisan, highly political nature is somewhat unique. And as we've become, as a people, as a society, as we've become more divided along those kind of lines politically, um, the parties, because parties are vote maximizers, right? They want to attract votes. They've embraced those divisions and in some ways stoked them even further. And I think that's part of our polarization story. There's also a kind of geographic sorting element to this story. Now, some of this geographic sorting happens naturally, right? People generally tend to live next to people that are like them. And so some of that geographic residential sorting is by choice, but also there's a partisan nature to some of this sorting, and that of course is the practice of gerrymandering, right? Drawing election district lines to benefit one party or candidate and disadvantage others. And gerrymandering's been around as long as the United States has been around, but we've never been as highly gerrymandered as a country as we are today, right? We are now down to a point, whether it's through normal residential sorting by choice or whether it's through partisan gerrymandering, that at most, we have 60 to 75 seats in the House of Representatives each cycle that are truly competitive, right? That are truly could be won by a candidate of either party. It's never been that high in American politics, right? So, and as we become more um, divided in our sorting, that's contributed to our polarization, right? Um, And then one other thing I think that's worth noting that is really unique in our current period, as opposed to most of American political history, is the high degree to which today someone's partisanship and ideology line up and match, right? And what I mean by that is today, if someone tells you they are a Republican, you can, with a high degree of certainty, also determine that this person would identify as a conservative, right? And the same thing with someone who's a Democrat. They're almost certainly also would identify to you as a liberal or a progressive. Um, Throughout most of American history, that simply hasn't been true, right? Um, Within each of our major parties, whatever they may be, I mean, since the Civil War, it's been the Democrats and Republicans, but if you want to go back pre-Civil War, you could have Democrats and Whigs. Um, there were ideological differences within each of our major parties. So you, for example, in the 1930s, all right, the Democrats are the dominant party nationally in the United States, and they have a prominent liberal faction, but they also have a very strong conservative wing, mostly in the South, but not exclusively. And those wings didn't always get along with each other, right? And so that would, when you've got differing factions within a party, that tends to decrease differences between the parties. And today, we don't have as much of that as we used to. And I think that's a big change, right? Um, the last thing that I would say that's occurred over the last 50 years that has strongly, in my opinion, contributed to our high levels of political division and polarization is something that I think is unique to our period. This is not something that we would find in previous eras of American politics, and that is how the larger media environment has changed, and in particular the rise of electronic media and within digital media, and within that the rise of social media, right? Yes, previous changes in media technology have had big impacts on American politics. Television, for example, is one that comes immediately to mind, but radio too. But never before in American history has an individual been able to personally curate their media environment to directly line up with their tastes and preferences in such a way as they can today, right? And not only that, but that social media allows individuals a certain degree of remove or a certain barrier between them and the person they're communicating with, which in some cases causes people to think they are freer to share things that maybe they would not have felt comfortable saying or doing or sharing when they had to have a more personal connection with someone. So I think all of those things, culture wars, issues, social and economic change, geographic sorting, partisan gerrymandering, the increasing correlation of partisanship and ideology, and then larger media environment change are really the factors we need to focus on when we're trying to understand how we got to this highly polarized state. Right? So with that, right, what are the consequences from being so polarized? One big consequence is political gridlock. Right, we find it increasingly difficult, I think, as a society to get anything accomplished politically. Right, and that isn't necessarily a problem, but it can be, and plenty of Americans think that it is. I think we've also, our high levels of polarization have also put us into a place of pretty high political instability, right? That depending on who's in office and who has the majority, policy can vary widely, and we can get kind of policy whiplash. And I think that's something that we see today that we haven't usually seen in American politics. We've seen a declining trust in government and politics. There's no doubt about that, right? The data are crystal clear on that. We have rising levels of alienation from politics among Americans who increasingly think that the system is broken and for some of them irreparable. We have seen the rise of what political scientists call affective polarization. And what that means is people see their own political identity, their own partisanship is central to who they are. And along with that, they harbor a deep personal dislike of people from the other party. We've had that before, but you really have to go back to the middle of the 19th century. We can't compare levels because we don't have survey data from the 1850s and 60s and 70s, but we know that it was there. But I think it's higher today than it probably ever has been. And maybe the most concerning consequence, at least for me, of where we are currently in our politics, we're starting to see signs, and some people would say more than signs, of real institutional breakdown and failure. Right? When we entered this period of high polarization, say 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and someone would contact me with high levels of concern, I would almost always try and reassure them and say, this is all true, but we've got safeguards and guardrails in place, and the system is always held, and there's no reason to think that it won't hold this time. I don't necessarily give those kind of answers anymore, right? I think the system is holding, but it's showing some signs of cracks, and I think we're in real danger of democratic backsliding here. We've seen it happen in other places. And to think that we in the United States are immune to that, I think would be a mistake, right? So last before, because I do want to leave plenty of time for questions. Last thing I want to just throw out there briefly is what we might do about this, right? Because I think that's something that a lot of people are interested in. They'll say, well, okay, we're in this spot that we're in, and it's good to understand how we got there, but what can we do about it, right? Unfortunately, I don't think we have any quick fixes to this, right? There are some ways in which we could envision our current situation improving, polarization going down, unity coming back up, lowering the temperature a little bit. None of them are guaranteed, and I don't think any of them are quick fixes, right? I mean, one thing that we have seen in the past that's helped bring the country together after a period of high polarization has been some kind of a unifying event, right? Something that happens that causes Americans maybe to set aside some of their differences and come together in an attempt to respond to a challenge or a crisis. You could make the case that COVID was one of those events. And briefly, Americans did seem to come together until all of a sudden COVID turned out to be just yet another polarizing event. So doesn't mean that we couldn't get some kind of unifying event, but so far, no dice on that, right? Another way out of this might be social and social change, in particular population change, right? American society is dynamic and fluid, and as you know, the population changes through generational replacement. The issues might change, and as that happens, our party systems can change, right? That's happened plenty of times before, and I suspect it'll happen again. But that's a long-term solution. It's not something that happens overnight. We could rely on partisan or leadership change, right? That someone, one of the parties decides we want to move beyond this. They select leadership who goes to great pains to try and overcome difference and build unity and larger, more broader coalitions. Possible, but the system isn't really set up to reward a party for doing that, right? So wouldn't say that's impossible, but I would say it's unlikely, right? We could change the rules, right? We could try and change the rules of the game. And anytime you change the rules, you have a strong likelihood of changing outcomes, right? One thing that we've done here in Maine to try and lower levels of political division is introduce ranked choice voting, right? And one of the arguments in favor of ranked choice voting is that it will reduce partisan polarization. It will produce more candidates in the center of the spectrum, giving people greater choice. That's what people want. Those are the kind of candidates that will win. If we went to ranked choice voting, it would definitely, it's a fundamental rule change. Whether it would change the outcome, we'd have to see, right? Another reform some people are suggesting is to abolish the Electoral College, right? Let's go directly to direct popular vote for president. Big rule change. Would it change the type of candidates, presidential candidates we get? Would it change winners? Maybe, right? We just don't know. But that would be a fundamental rule change. There's some people who are arguing getting rid of the equal state representation in the United States Senate, right? You'd have to amend the Constitution to do that, of course, the same way that you would with the Electoral College, but it's doable. And there's certainly no doubt that the inequities created by the way we select the Senate have a big impact on our politics, right? So that could be a change. We could get rid of partisan gerrymandering, something we've already talked about, right? And we could turn over district line drawing to nonpartisan, impartial bodies, which is already done in some states, by the way. Would that change outcomes? I think so. Would it be enough to end polarization? Maybe, right? And then finally, and I can see that Jacob is reading my mind. Jacob, a former student of mine, who just started grad school. To congrats to Jake. Is we could look at campaign finance, right? And there's no doubt that Citizens United and the aftermath of Citizens United has dramatically increased the amount of money in American politics. It's made it more difficult to track that. And if we were to engage in real campaign finance reform, it would change the way in which we conduct campaigns and elections. Again, would it change outcomes? I don't know, but it would certainly change how we conduct them. All of these would be possible solutions. Some are shorter term, some are longer term. All are doable. Would they work? Maybe, right? We just don't know that. Are they politically doable? I'm a little more skeptical on that. I don't see a lot of political will for many of those. But one thing I am confident in saying is that none of them would represent a quick fix, right? And I guess where I'll end is we didn't get to where we are overnight. And I don't think there's any way to get out of it overnight either. So with that, I thank you all for listening to me spew for 20 minutes or so, and turn it over to Tom to or however he wants to conduct the questions.
Super. Mark, thank you very much. That was terrific. And we do have some questions in the chat already. Just a reminder to folks that as we move into the Q&A portion now, you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom under the React button if you would like to ask your question directly of Dr. Brewer, and we will call on you. Or you can put questions in the chat, and I do see that several people have done that already. So we'll kind of alternate between live questions and chat questions as we have both, but I'll start with one from the chat. The first one I see in there was a question about will we be seeing more gerrymandering and will that negatively impact Congress? You touched on that a little bit, but perhaps you could expand on that.
Well, I mean, in some ways, it would be hard to do more gerrymandering, right? We have seen some this cycle, right? As a number of states, it was started by Texas, but then other states, either followed suit or retaliated, um, have engaged in trying to redraw their lines mid-decade to advantage one party or the other. And so we could see, and there are a few more states where that could happen. However, we're already pretty highly gerrymandered. So will there's a limit, there's an upper limit on to how much more gerrymandering we can see. The more interesting question, the way I look at it is there any way to reduce gerrymandering, right? And that's a more difficult question. The Supreme Court has, for the most part, thrown up their hands on gerrymandering issues and said that it's a political question and we don't get involved in political questions. They do sometimes get involved if it's a matter of race and districts, but this current Supreme Court hasn't even shown an appetite for that. So I think the current Supreme Court will allow more gerrymandering. I think they've made that clear. How much more we can get, I guess we can get to the point where we can't do any more, but I don't think we're all that far from it. So it would be more interesting to see if we could move in the other direction.
Right. Not seeing any brave souls raising their hands yet. So we'll go to another question in the chat here. Is there a society, another country that has a unifying goal that we could emulate for societal change?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not particularly well qualified to answer that. I'm an American. I'm an Americanist, so I study American politics and government, and that means that in a lot of ways I can be, woefully ignorant about kind of the politics and society of other nations. I mean, I suppose, we could look, at some of the Scandinavian countries, right, where there's seemingly a much more widely agreed upon commitment to, a strong social safety net and kind of higher quality of life for all citizens. Maybe Japan might be another model that we could point to, but I think it is also important to point out that those countries are much smaller than the United States and also tend to be much less diverse. And so by nature, there's probably a much lower degree of difference of opinion and perspective in those countries. I can't think of, and it doesn't mean it's not out there. If I had one of my comparativist colleagues here, I'm sure they could answer this better than I am, but I can't think of a country of similar size and diversity that we could point to as a model to say this might be something that would be useful to us. I can't think of one like that. At least that is has a representative free form of government. If you had a authoritarian regime, then you could impose that to some degree from the top down, right? But we can't do that, at least not yet.
Okay. I do see a raised hand from Jacob, so I'll ask him to unmute and ask his question.
I want to ask Jacob a question first, though. When do you start? When do you start
This summer?
Okay. Congratulations.
Thank you. Going back to the 90s, don't you think like a lot of that unity has to do with like the fall of the USSR and like a socialist message in America being defeated, basically?
Yeah, I think there's certainly something to that, right? I mean, one of the things that we didn't talk about that marked the 90s was there was this, kind of euphoria at the fall of the Soviet Union, and a rise to prominence of, kind of these end of history ideas, right? Like the liberal West has won, and that everyone is gonna fall in line and adapt their society along the lines of, post-industrial westernized democracy, and conflict will go away. And so I think there was a certain element of that at play there. That turned out, of course, to not be true. And I think, part of as that idea or belief in that idea maybe collapsed and was empirically shown not to be the case, that I think you're right, Jacob, that probably did seem to further stoke division, right? Because I mean, one of the things that is intensely dividing, the two sides right now is, where should we go moving forward? Should we move in this, kind of more progressive, forward-looking direction, or would we, be better served by going back in time to a 1950 style America? And that really is a fundamental difference of opinion on the right and the left today. So I think that's a good point.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to grab another one from the chat, and then we'll go to Joe with a live question here in just a second. So from the chat, there are a lot of people who disagree with either ultra-left or ultra-right ideology, and they are alienated by both. Moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats do not agree with their parties. What is the reason, in your opinion, that this moderate group that can make a big difference on the political arena, or can they make a big difference on the political arena? Why do they not unite into their own party and participate in elections?
I think there's a number of different things that contribute to an answer to that. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the questioner is right that there is a large portion of the American public, might not be a majority, but it certainly would constitute a plurality, who don't like kind of the extremes of either party, their own or the opposition, right? That they would prefer a more centrist option, whether that be within one of the current major parties, or maybe even better yet, in their view, a third party that is more centrist. The difficulty in that, part of it has to do, a big part of it has to do with rules of the game, right? Someone put into the chat, they thought that ranked choice voting would help with that. I think they're right. The way that the vast majority of elections are organized in the United States is single member districts with first past the post winner, right? And I'm not going to go into the political theory of Maurice Duverger, but Duverger was a scholar of elections, and he said that in a first past the post system with single member districts, you're always going to get down to two major parties, always, and he's been right about that. So if we wanted to get a third party, we'd have to change the electoral rules of the game. That would be one thing. I think another contributing factor there is the gerrymandering, obviously, that we already talked about, and the residential sorting, right? There are many districts that are both heavily liberal, and then there are some districts that are heavily liberal, and then more that are heavily conservative, right? And so those kind of districts are going to put forward a highly liberal or a highly conservative candidate. And then there's the way in which we select our general election candidates. We overwhelmingly use a direct primary system, which is great. It allows individual people to select the candidates they want to run for their party. But we know that the kind of voters who participate in primary elections tend to be more extreme voters. The more moderate voters tend to sit those out. And so when you have the more extreme voters selecting the candidates, by the time the more moderate voters come in to vote in the general, what their choices already are have been determined for them. So I think that the questioner is right, but in order to get something along the lines of what they would seem to prefer, I think we'd have to have some pretty fundamental structural change in terms of how we conduct our elections in this country. And because the people who would be making that change are overwhelmingly office holders of the two major parties who are benefiting from the current rules, I wouldn't hold your breath on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to go to a live question from Joe Hanley. Joe, you can unmute. Go ahead. Good to see you.
Hey, Professor. Good to be with everyone. So, as someone that graduated in '92, and remembering my political science professor, Ken Hayes, telling us to throw out our textbooks before the wall fell and replace with new textbooks. It's interesting to reflect back on that. And I had the opportunity to work for Bill Cohen and as a congressional intern and as a staffer on the Hill and harken back. I think that the state of Maine has a lot to export through its history as to how, moderate politics and consensus can work. I'm not sure if it's just to kind of push on the question. The question I had was similar to what you got in the comments, right? And is there an opportunity? Is maybe the time right now for more of a parliamentary third party push, not from the people in office, but from the people with respect to the breaking down of our institutions and democracy. So you look at the No Kings movement, which is nothing like any of us have ever seen before. I wasn't alive enough. Yeah, I wasn't around for Vietnam and those protests, but it's certainly significant. And you have now, you spoke about the history where you would have Democrats from the South and Democrats from the North. But for those of us that are, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not a progressive, right? Where are our homes, right? Where's the home for the new Bill Cohen's or the Lincoln Project or Liz Cheney, right? And so my question is there an opportunity that you see that because of all the breakdowns in our institutions and democracy and organizing, that that third party, which really does represent a third of the people, and let's call it common sense. You have on one side MAGA, which I would say is not necessarily Republican, but that's the party. And that's where they are. They own that, right? The Republicans own that. And then you have Democratic Socialists, which is nowhere in the platform of the Democratic Party to the far left. And then you have a third of the people, as I mentioned, like me, all the way from Liz Cheney to the Lincoln Project. And then you see Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherry winning recently. I would put them in that box. So is there an opportunity for the people to rise up and bring something like this? I know we have these discussions about third parties. It never seems to come to fruition, but I think the world's in a lot of trouble now, and institutions don't seem to really have traction. And, maybe there's a possibility now that wasn't there before. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think you're right in that there's a real appetite, I think, on the part of a big group of Americans, right? And it might even be bigger than the third that you put out there. I mean, it could be as many as 45% of Americans who really want something exactly like what you described. I think the difficulty that we face in bringing something like that into fruition is the fact, again, not to keep harping on the rules, but the rules that we have in place make that very difficult to achieve, right? The rules that are in place heavily advantage the two major parties and heavily push us in the direction of a two-party system, right? Now, that doesn't mean that can't be overcome because the overwhelming amount of American political history has been a two-party system, right? But there have been periods of time, if you go back in, let's say the 1870s, 1880s, right? The people's, or more commonly the populist party. Populists, they won seats, right? They organized campaigns, they won seats, they elected members of Congress, they elected a few governors, they elected members of state legislatures. And in fact, there was a real concern among both Democrats and Republicans, but more so for the Democrats, that the People's Party was going to displace the Democrats, right, in the 1890s. And so I think that's why the Democrats cut a deal with the Populist Party, right? You fuse with us and we'll adopt a lot of your issue positions in our platform. And so they did that, right? So it doesn't mean it can't be overcome. But boy, the amount of work that would have to go into building something like that from the ground up in adverse conditions, right? Rules that are stacked against you would be very difficult. Now, if you wanted to try and build it from the top down and start with the highest level of office, start with the presidency, that might be a more interesting approach, right? Because there you can get around some of the rules that way. And that's a possibility, right? We've never had a non-major party candidate, of course, win the presidency. And it's been over, I mean, I don't know how long ago, 1968. I mean, it's been a long time since we've even had a non-major party candidate get an electoral college vote, right? I mean, everybody thinks about Ross Perot, but Perot didn't get an electoral college vote. That might be the more interesting possibility. And then if that kind of a movement were to say secure the presidency, then would they be able to backfill the infrastructure and the party apparatus after the fact? Maybe, right? Still a huge lift. There's no doubt about that. But if somebody were to charge me with doing that, I'm almost always a bottom up guy, but I think I think I'd have a better chance for success of starting top down in that particular instance.
Great, thank you. Question in the chat about extremist foreign mechanisms implemented like ICE in Europe, where Karina is now. They are seeing an extreme transition of seclusion of the U.S. when it comes to legal migration.
So I guess Tom, I'm not sure what the question is.
Right. So so it doesn't really clearly come to a question in this chat, I don't think. So my question is about extremist foreign mechanisms implemented like ICE in Europe. We are seeing extreme transition of seclusion of the U.S. when it comes to legal migration. So
well, I mean,
you can go ahead.
If it's something along the lines of how would decreased immigration impact the current situation? It's a good question. I think it would, maybe further harden the lines that are already in place, right? I think anytime, social change has at least presents the opportunity of upsetting the apple cart a little bit and, kind of causing coalitional change and immigration at high levels is of course social change. So I think if you were to get rid of that, then that, would probably harden the lines where they are and maybe further calcify the system. But I'm not sure if that's the question. I guess that's how I'd answer it, but I'm not sure if that's what the question is.
Okay. Perhaps she can provide some clarification later. I am going to try to prioritize people that haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, and perhaps we can get back to others who have a second question before we get to the end. But the next one from Steve: how complicit is Maine's media in all this, presumably being the partisanship? The Portland Press Herald is, this writer says, clearly a liberal newspaper, and also cites the Maine Wire that reports from a conservative viewpoint. Is one better than the other, or are they just both catering to their audience?
I think overall, kind of, if we take a national look at this first, I think the media play a not insignificant role here. I mean, I think the media environment today doesn't resemble at all, I would say, the media environment, at least of my youth of the 1970s and early 1980s, right? It's much more openly ideological and much more openly partisan. And it also is incredibly fragmented, right? I mean, it's virtually impossible now to find a mass audience in one particular place or in a couple of places. You just can't do that anymore. And I think that's maybe I'm not saying that the ideological or partisan nature of certain media outlets doesn't matter. I think it does, right? And I think it matters in particular when people only choose to avail themselves of media voices that echo what they already believe, right? Putting oneself in an echo chamber is never a good thing, I would argue, right? But I think maybe the bigger change has been kind of this incredible fragmentation of the media environment has created a situation where, we're not getting the same information, right? If we go back to the 1970s, whether you liked it or not, if you wanted to stay up on current events, or even if you just wanted to watch television, you were probably watching one of the 3 network nightly news broadcasts at 6:30, right? And they were covering more or less the same issues. That's not true today, right? We're not even getting access to the same information, much less the same slant on that information which makes it very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to have anything resembling kind of a national conversation, which is interesting because the technology would seem that it would make it easier for us to do that than at any point in American history previously. And that's what people thought the internet was going to do when it first came on the scene, right? There were all these, the internet's going to solve a lot of our problems. Yeah, well, I'm not so sure about that. At least our political problems.
Great, thank you. Next question in the chat. What are some potential effects of the SAVE Act and its new divide in the area of gender as well as socioeconomic status?
Well, I think the SAVE Act, if it were to pass, and for those who might not be familiar with it, the SAVE Act is the name of a bill that would have a relatively large number of fundamental changes in how we conduct elections in the United States. The SAVE Act is the kind of fundamental change to the electoral rules of the game, which could have a serious impact on election, not only how we conduct them, but on outcomes, right? If that legislation were to be enacted in full, I think it would make it much more difficult for certain populations in the United States to vote. I think it would make it much more inconvenient for people to vote. Would it make elections any more secure? Maybe at the margins, in my opinion, although some people would disagree with that. But I think it would almost certainly disenfranchise some folks, and it would make it much more difficult for a larger group of people to vote. And when you do something like that, that has a pretty large potential to change outcomes.
Next question in the chat is about open primaries if they were to be expanded to all states, and would this help get rid of the power of state political parties in the election process?
Well, there's no doubt that open primaries, particularly if you're going to go all the way open, right? Weaken parties, right? Weaken party control over elections. There's no doubt about that, right? If we were to look at the so-called top two model in California, sometimes referred to as a jungle primary, that really does weaken the control that parties have in the nominating process, for sure, right? And if you were to go with an open primary where anybody could participate in any primary, regardless of what party they're registered for or not. And if you really wanted to go all the way, and that they could alternate office on a particular ballot, like I want to participate in the Republican primary for this office, the Democratic primary in this one, or just go complete top two like California has. I think that has the potential really to change the type of candidates that we find in general elections come November, or at other times if we're talking about some state generals. But I think that has some real potential to do that. Now, what would that mean? What that ultimately would mean would depend on where you're instituting it, right? In California, it usually means you get a couple of relatively progressive Democrats. If you were to do a top two system in a place like Texas, statewide, you're probably going to get a couple of pretty conservative candidates. But if you were to do it in a swing type of state, you probably get a couple of moderates. And that could be interesting, right, if you were to do that.
Right. Next question. As you look across the country, do you see any probability that the U.S. Senate could change control? And if it does, would that potentially have a negative impact on the University of Maine and the state of Maine?
Good question, right? I mean, I think that first of all, I think there's no doubt that the United States Senate race in Maine in 2026 is the most hotly watched United States Senate race across the country. I have had more contact from journalists who work for national, in some cases international outlets on that race already than any other one that's taken place since I've been here in Maine, right? So, in fact, I just talked to someone from the Washington Post earlier, right before I got on here. So they're watching that race intently. And I think both parties are watching that race intently, right? I think that it's not a stretch of the imagination to see control of the Senate coming down to the race between Susan Collins and whoever it is that comes out of the Democratic primary, or most likely Graham Plattner or Janet Mills. That being said, I think that partisan there's two questions there. I'll try and answer each part. Flipping partisan control of the Senate is going to be more difficult this cycle than flipping control of the House because again, not all Senate seats are up every cycle. It's only about a third plus any specials. And the Senate environment this cycle is much more beneficial to Republicans than it is to Democrats. So Democrats are going to have to work very hard and get a little bit lucky, to be honest with you, in a couple of races to flip the Senate. I think they're much more likely to flip the House. I think at this point, I think it's a virtual lock they flip the House. All right. To go to the other part of the question of what would it mean for the state of Maine or the university, I think that question is really asking what happens if Senator Collins loses, right? Because Senator Collins has, as she is, takes no, does not fail to point out, has been among the most successful members of the United States Senate in bringing home earmarks to benefit her state, whether that be local governments, businesses in the state, the university system. There's no doubt that Senator Collins has done that. As chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, she is particularly well positioned to do that right now. Would that change obviously, if she's not there, she personally can't do it? We do know that, virtually all members of Congress try and bring home benefits for their districts because they want to get reelected. But let's face it. I mean, the reality is Senator Collins has, got, 30 plus years in the United States Senate. She is very high up on the seniority list. She's chairing a committee, the committee that controls the purse strings. And that is definitely an advantage for the state as a whole in terms of what she is able to do with appropriations. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Right. Well, we have many more questions, and apologies to those that didn't get answered, but we do have a commitment to our stop at 1:00 here. So I want to just thank you all for participating with us, especially thank you, Dr. Brewer, for a great presentation and being so generous with your time. Also want to thank our Alumni Association staff who's been working hard behind the scenes to make this event happen. So we'd encourage you to keep in touch with us and keep an eye on umainalumni.com for other alumni events and future webinars too. But Dr. Brewer, thanks again for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was my pleasure. And I love these kind of events. So if I can do one again in the future, I'd be happy to do it.
Terrific. Thanks, everybody.